My dear children, St. James the Greater, called this way to distinguish him from the other Santiago, who was also part of the 12 apostles, was one of the 3 preferred apostles of our Lord Jesus Christ. This St. James was the brother of St. John, who was the beloved apostle, St. John the Evangelist. These 2 were brothers, sons of Zebedee, that was their father's name, and their mother's name was Salome, most likely one of the women who followed Jesus Christ. St. James the Greater was, as I told you, one of the most illustrious apostles of our Lord, and he was a very mysterious man, as happens with all the great men of the history of humanity, and this is one of those great men. About his life, we know that he died between the year 41 and 44 by the king Herod Agrippa, who had his head cut off. He seems to have been one of the first, if not the first, apostles to have suffered martyrdom. St. James nowadays appears as the patron saint of Spain, and the reason is that mysteriously his sepulchre, his tomb, appeared in Galicia around the 9th century in Santiago de Compostela, and also because legend has it that he miraculously took part in the Battle of Clavijo when the Christians were being slaughtered by the Muslims. As I was saying, of the few things we know about his history, maybe part legend, about this extraordinary man, we are also told that he came to Spain. He, along with supposedly St. Paul, came to preach in Spain, to evangelize Spain. And finding himself a bit disheartened by how little success his preaching was having with the inhabitants of the peninsula back then, while the Virgin Mary was still alive in Palestine, she appeared to him and urged him to continue his work in Spain and to build a shrine where she appeared to him. According to legend, St. James and his disciples built up a chapel which nowadays is the Basilica of the Pillar in Zaragoza. Used to be called Caesar Augustus, and over time it became Zaragoza. St. James also had 7 special disciples in Spain, 7, and he sent them to Jerusalem so that the apostles would ordain them bishops. These 7 men, who later on, after St. James died, they took care of evangelizing Spain. They were called the 7 apostolic men, the first bishops that Spain had after St. James. As I told you at the beginning, the little that we know about this man, most of it a legend, is enough, however, to enshrine him in a light of mystery, a mystery of greatness, as happens with all great men of history. Not a greatness as the world considers greatness, but true greatness, greatness which is given by God. The mystery and the aura of light around that which is supernatural also surround this man who was marvelous and grandiose. And you might ask why. But the great men who we know about in the history of humanity, well, the most marvelous, incredible details about their lives usually go unnoticed. And yet, those details are the things that define them best as extraordinary men and models for everyone else. Where do we find the greatness of this man? Well, let us consider one thing first. Was there something special about this man who we call James the Greater? Through many centuries, millions and millions of Christians coming from all over the world have made a pilgrimage to his sepulchre, to pray in front of the sepulchre of this saint in Santiago de Compostela, in Galicia, in Spain. Millions and millions of pilgrims have walked the path of Santiago. The pilgrimage of St. James, which supposedly follows the Milky Way and could be walked following the stars, there were paths coming from all over to go to Santiago de Compostela, and those paths still exist. And the millions of pilgrims continue to go to the tomb of the Apostle St. James. Something extraordinary there had to be in this wonderful man when throughout centuries he has brought to his tomb millions of Christians to pray to him. It's the third tomb most visited by Christianity. First, the sepulchre of Jesus Christ in Jerusalem. Second, that of St. Peter in Rome. And third, the tomb of St. James in Compostela. Why is that? Why did so many millions of men and women, and children as well, make this journey and continue to do so to the tomb of this man? What is the greatness of this man? Well, first of all, because of how close and intimate he was with Jesus Christ. He is one of the three most beloved disciples of our Lord. He was one of the 12 apostles, but among those 12, Jesus had 3 who were his favorites: James the Greater, John his brother, John the Evangelist later on, and above all, St. Peter. The 3 were present, for example, at the resurrection of the daughter of Jairus. The 3, for example, were there when Jesus was transfigured up on the mountain, when he appeared shining in his divinity in front of these 3 apostles. Also, they were the 3 who were present at the agony of Jesus Christ in the Garden of Olives before the Passion of Jesus Christ. Intimacy with Jesus Christ. This intimacy, this closeness with Jesus was enough for the greatness and the glory and the mystery, the aura of mystery of someone who is between humanity and divinity, or better yet, participates both in that which is human and that which is divine, that is Jesus Christ. Well, the closeness to this was enough to make this man, James the Greater, an extraordinary man. He also let off an aura of greatness, of magnificence, that has attracted multitudes of Christians throughout the years. But above this and beyond this, there are many moments in the life of this man that we don't really notice that speak of his greatness. greatness as a man, and greatness as a disciple of Jesus Christ. On a certain occasion, Jesus was preaching and speaking to the multitudes, as always. And he was among a great number of people, and there was all of a sudden an uproar. There was a woman. Women are always the ones to start these loud altercations. She was bound and determined to reach Jesus Christ, along with her 2 children, James and his brother John. And so, elbowing herself through the crowd, she makes her way up to the Master, and she says, "Master, I am here to ask of you something that is very important." She was dragging her 2 sons with her, James on one side and John on the other. 2 young men. They were very young. They had been recruited by Jesus Christ from the job they had with St. Peter. They were companions in the fishing business with St. Peter. They were very young. And Jesus said to her, "What is it that you want?" She said, "What do I want? Well, I want that when you are in your kingdom, since you are God, that in your kingdom you seat one of my children at your right hand and one at your left." And the Lord looks at her, and women always the same, thinking about their children, thinking about greatness and even crazy things for their children. And Jesus looks at her and says, "You do not know what you are asking." And then, putting aside the mother, he addresses the 2 young men. They seem to understand him better. The question that he was going to ask was something that was going to be well understood by the 2 young men than by the mother. And without any delay, he said to the 2 young men, "Are you able to drink the chalice that I must drink?" The chalice of his suffering, his passion, his death. These 2 young men understood him right away. They didn't take long thinking about it. Actually, they didn't take any time at all. They answered him right away. They said, "We can." The Bible answers with one word, possumus, which means we can. And he said, "Well, then you will drink of my chalice, but as for sitting on my right or my left, that's something that my Father has reserved for himself to give." First cause of greatness that we see, that we admire in this man. It's his decision, his decisiveness, his courage, his bravery. Decision or decisiveness is contrary to the undecided, people who never decide, people who never choose, people who never make decisions. They're always thinking about it. They never think about now. They never think about today. They're always thinking about tomorrow. Tomorrow, sure, someday I'll study. Sure, someday I'll convert. Someday I'll give the Lord everything. Someday I'll be a saint. Someday I'll love the Lord with all my heart. No, someday, after this, soon, very soon, but they are undecided people. They're always push things off to later on. And that's the craziest thing one could do. The craziest thing we could ever think of, because when the Lord proposes something for now, for this moment, for this day, how can you leave that for tomorrow, or for afterwards, or for next year? Are you going to find reasons that are wiser or stronger, that are strong enough for you to leave off what the Lord is asking of you for some later date? Do you think that your reasons to put off what He's asking of you are stronger than the reasons that Jesus has of asking you to do something here and now? That's crazy. That's proper of those who are undecided, those who don't have willpower, people who don't have a heart. Those people who don't know bravery, they have no idea about courage, and they never amount to anything anyway, because they're always thinking about it. They're always thinking that someday they'll make that decision, someday, tomorrow probably, but as the saying goes, tomorrow never comes. It never comes. We're always living in today, we're always living in now, never in tomorrow. But James the Greater, along with his brother John, didn't think about it for a second. He said, "We can." They said it together. And the Lord proposes something to them that is quite different from what the mother asked. The mother was thinking about glory for them. Glory, fame, greatness, the easy, showy life. And Jesus proposes suffering, hard work, self-denial, poverty, death, the cross. And he proposes it to them as the better way, the better path, the better option. Like all things in Christianity, this also seems crazy. Of course, because the criteria of a Christian life against the criteria of the world seem to be quite crazy. That's why the world can never understand Christianity, and it can never understand Christians. Any Christian that is understood by the world, or any Christian that understands the world, suddenly and automatically ceases to be a Christian. That's what St. James himself said. He said that anyone who is a friend of the world is an enemy to God, and anyone who is a friend of God is an enemy to the world. That's something that St. James said, the feast day that we celebrate today, in his letter. We can stop and analyze. Let's see. Jesus proposes his idea of the two ways. According to the Lord, there are two ways. There's the wide path of ease and commodity, the path on which most people walk. But that, of course, as Jesus said, leads to perdition. And then, the apparent contradiction, the paradox, the narrow path, the steep path, the difficult path, the path on which very few people walk, the path that leads to life. The Lord shows them both of these options, option A and option B, and says, well, which one do you choose? And they chose the option of the narrow path, the path of suffering. But this path of suffering, this narrowness, this participation in the death of Christ, is it better than the easy way, the path of comfort, the path of the easy life, of the fulfillment of one's own whims, one's doing his own will, living his own life? He who lives his own life will lose it. Only he who loses his life for my sake will find it, etc., etc. Why, then, is the narrow path more beautiful, more sublime, more meritorious and greater, and in all senses bigger and better than the easy way? Because the narrow path is the one that makes us share in the life of Christ. And therefore it is the one that makes us live love. I'm going to give you an example for you to understand. Let us suppose that there are two friends who, because they are friends, they appreciate each other. They love each other. And one says to the other, I'm going to be your friend. I'm going to be with you as long as things are easy for me. As long as things are easy, you can count on me. I'll be there. When things are agreeable, I'll be right there. When we're invited to a banquet, a good meal, I'll be there. When I'm invited to have a nice time, to go on a trip, I'll be there. But when there's something difficult, when we have to face something that is troublesome, when we have to make a sacrifice, if I have to sacrifice to help you out, at those moments, don't count on me at all. I won't be there. But where then is love? True love would be shown when the friend in question would tell the other, look, it doesn't matter whether things are good or bad. It doesn't matter. But when I'll be most ready to help you, when I'll be most ready to be by your side, is when things are bad. When sacrifice calls, when we have to face something tough. And if I have to die with you, I will die with you. I remember when I was young, there was a refrain that said, in prison and in sickness is where you know true friendship. When someone is in prison, or when someone is in the hospital, the people who go to visit that person are his true friends. When someone is in prison or in the hospital, they're not visited by their true friends. When you're poor, you have by your side those who are your true friends. When you're rich, your false friends are the ones who come calling. True friendship, that is, true love, is to walk with the person that we love in that which is easy and above all in that which is difficult. That's where love is truly shown. That's where the desire to share the life of the person that you love can be seen. So, with great difference, option B, or the most difficult option, is greater, more beautiful, more meritorious than the wide path, than the easy way. And St. James the Greater was not one of the undecisive. He was a man of decision, great resolve. At that very moment he said, yes, we can. I'm with you. And he showed that throughout his life, all the way up to his death. It was the year 41 or the year 44 when King Herod Agrippa had his head cut off. At the beginning of the 9th century, more or less the year 813, in Galicia, on a hillside, a lost hillside, there was a hermit whose name was Pelagius, and he saw some lights, and he thought that there was something miraculous about them, and so he told the bishop. I think the bishop's name was Teodovido, and they told the king. The king back then was King Alfonso II, the Chaste of Asturias, and they began to dig in the ground, and they found a sepulchre. They found a tomb of a man who had been decapitated and had his head under his arm. They started to investigate. There were many investigations. Even the popes got into it and began to investigate and try to find out who that was, until finally they determined that they were the remains of James the Apostle. And so from that century on, from the 9th century on, there is a conviction, the true conviction, both in Spain and in the rest of the world, that that was the tomb of James the Greater. That's the way it was believed and is still believed nowadays, and that began in the 9th century. In the year 844, if I'm not mistaken, in the Battle of Clavijo, near Rioja, Christians were being overtaken by the Muslims. The battle was reaching its end. There were very few Christian knights still alive. They were being beaten. And all of a sudden, riding through the clouds, with a fiery sword in hand, came St. James the Greater. This was the 23rd of May, 844, the Battle of Clavijo. People discuss, and some people put in doubt, the truth of what was told about the Battle of Clavijo, but it is something that has always been believed in Spain, that St. James, with a fiery sword in hand, saved the Christians and gave them victory over the Muslims. This battle was the one that put an end to the famous tribute of 1,000 maidens. Christians had to give to the Muslims every year 100 maidens as a tribute of a conquered people. It was a tax they had to pay to their conquerors. But that tribute came to an end with this battle, the Battle of Clavijo. I've thought many times about the veracity of this event in Clavijo, whether it's history or just a legend. I've always believed in it, though, as so many people have. St. James then also received a nickname, and it was James the Muslim Killer, thanks to this battle. The image of James the Muslim Killer was always shown with St. James on his horse and his fiery sword in hand, and at the foot of the horse he was riding, many heads of Muslims who had been decapitated, had been killed by him. Nowadays, in our times, it's something to laugh about. These times that we live in, which are so full of prejudices, what they do with statues of St. James the Muslim Killer is to cover the heads of the Muslims that were rolling on the ground, to cover them even inside of churches. They cover them with flowers. They cover them in order to not hurt the feelings of the Muslims. This inferiority complex, which is in so many different ways attacking and on the shoulders of Christians of our time. We are almost ashamed of our religion. We feel diminished because there are very few Christians who live their faith, and those that do have this inferiority complex. But St. James never seemed to have that kind of complex in regard to the Muslims. He cut off their heads left and right. He had no kind of prejudice and no kind of inferiority complex. In this way also, St. James is a model for us. I hope, my beloved children, and I tell you this with my whole heart, if you have to be true men, if you have to give testimony of Jesus Christ in this world that is such an enemy to us, this world that has abandoned its faith, has committed blatant apostasy, you have to be men in this world without these kinds of complexes, especially not in an inferiority complex. You should never be ashamed of your faith. You have to be brave. I told you before what happened when I was more or less 14 years old, and I was on a train. I would go back and forth between Murcia and my house in the summer. I was studying in Murcia, and in Christmas and over the summer I would go back to my town. So I traveled that distance between Murcia and my town on the train, this high-velocity train, that to go 40 kilometers that there are between the two places, about 2.5 hours. 2.5 hours. You had to really prepare yourself to be able to take these high speeds that trains would go at to make 40 kilometers in 2.5 hours. You've seen trains like this in some old movies. those train cars where everyone's seated together. And one day when I was on the train, someone a few seats ahead of me was saying crazy things about religion, that God didn't exist, that Christ was just a legend, that the church was this or that priests were this or that, etc., etc. I was 14 years old at the time. I think I was 14, yeah. And I was listening to what he was saying. And when I got sick and tired of hearing the things he was saying, and as I got more and more angry, well, the time came in which I couldn't take it anymore. And I got up and I went to where he was. And I said, "Can I talk with you for a second?" And this man, in his haughty manner, said, "Sure, say whatever you want to." And I said, "Well, everything you're saying is a lie, it's wrong, and it's idiotic." And then we began to have a discussion. He despised me quite a bit. I didn't study much in that time, but I did read quite a bit. I read a lot. I used to read everything I could find. Not bad things, of course, only good things. Things about history, geography, religion, everything except for textbooks, which I hated. And we began to have this discussion. And as we had this discussion, this man made the mistake of citing the classics. And so the classics came out in the discussion. I don't think he had actually read a single one, but I had. I had read quite a few. I'd even read Molière, the Divine Comedy I'd also read. I was 10 years old when I read it for the first time. After my 10th birthday, I read the Quixote, Don Quixote, once a year. And I had such a wonderful memory when I was a child. I had a photographic memory. So he brought out the classics, and he spoke about the Quixote. And he said, "The Quixote, you have no idea about Don Quixote." And I said, "I do, and I know it by memory." And so he started to laugh. As this was going on, well, everyone had fallen silent, and everyone was listening to what we were saying. Since everyone was seated in the same place, and there was no privacy whatsoever, he said, "You don't know the Quixote." And I said, "I don't know it. I know it by memory." And so I said, "I'll show you." And so I recited a long quotation from Don Quixote. Now I can remember it more or less and only in pieces, but back then I knew it completely and perfectly. And so I started to recite this passage, and I went on and on and on. And as I did so, he was turning yellow out of fright. Everyone around was holding their breath as I recited the passage that Don Quixote says to the barber when he says that he is not Neptune, the god of the waters. "Nor do I try to be discreet, not being so. I only tire myself to let the world know the error in which it has fallen, in not renewing in itself the most happy times when knights roamed the face of the earth. And then we would, in these times, enjoy the greatness that they enjoyed back then," etc., etc., etc. And I went on and on and on. And when I finished that paragraph, everyone in the train was applauding and cheering, and of course this man got off at the next stop. Why do I say this? Well, because you cannot have an inferiority complex. You can't be ashamed of your faith. You can't be ashamed of your friendship with Christ or of your love for Christ, because if not, that love would cease to be love. If the world weighs more in us than the love for Jesus Christ or our fidelity to Jesus Christ, then that love and fidelity are both false. This is another thing, another lesson that we must learn from James the Greater. He was not a man who had any inferiority complex. James the Muslim killer had no inferiority complex. Muslims are enemies of the Christian faith. and enemies of humanity. Muhammad was a shameless man. He was a disgrace of a man. He was a criminal. And he would preach that everyone who did not believe in Allah had to be killed. So this man preached criminality. You saw it in last night's movie. You saw this. Those men wanted to earn for themselves the paradise of Allah. And look at the paradise of Allah. Look at all the dead people, all the wounded people, people who had lost limbs, so that these two people could prove themselves worthy of the paradise of Allah. So we see the greatness of the Apostle St. James. Because of his love and intimacy with Jesus Christ, he continues to move millions of people throughout the world who go to visit his tomb. But there's something even greater, something that seduces even more about this great apostle. Because the greatness that pours out of this man, because of his closeness with Jesus Christ, because of his intimacy with Jesus Christ, he was one of the three most beloved of Jesus Christ, that greatness of his is shared by any person who also has that closeness to Jesus Christ. A closeness that can be shared with more intimacy, with more efficiency, with more participation than that of James the Greater. Because we have Jesus in the tabernacle with us every single day. We have him in our prayer, and we bring him into our heart throughout the day, and not just in metaphor. Because he said, "He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood lives in me, and I live in him. In me manet et ego manio in eo. In me manet et ego in eo." He lives in me, and I remain in him. Not in metaphor. That closeness with Jesus Christ, that intimacy with Jesus Christ, that closeness with Jesus Christ, that confidence in him is greater and more intense than that which the apostle was able to have with his master. He was with the master for 3 years. There were always multitudes of people around them. There were always many activities that they were in, many things they had to do. And we, however, have Jesus for ourselves, to speak with him, to have that close friendship with him, to be loved by him, to have a conversation with him, to listen to what he has to say, and for him to listen to what we have to say. You see, there are so many things that we don't realize about James the Greater. But St. James is worth all of our admiration and fervor and love and respect and our putting ourselves in his hands, because now he's in heaven, seeing Jesus face to face, so that he may intercede for us. So today is an extraordinary feast for the entire church. The patron of Spain, James the Muslim killer, the patron of multitudes, who still moves millions of people to go visit his tomb. There's a reason for that. So let us now celebrate the Holy Mass in his honor, and that this Mass may increase our devotion to our Lord Jesus Christ. May we also have a closeness to Jesus like the one he had in life while he lived, and the one that he enjoys now in heaven, like the one that we have today with Jesus Christ from moment to moment, and that we will have in the future when we see him face to face, when we reach heaven.